سأرحب بكم باللغة العربية، هي لغة قلبي ولغة أهل الجنة، لكني سأتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. هكذا جاءتني الأوامر السنية. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Fadi Makki. I've known him for many years, and I've always admired his commitment to serve public good. I've known him as Director General of the Ministry of Economy. I've known him as an advisor to the Prime Minister, and I think we've become close friends since. We've been in touch since he moved to the various places in the Gulf where he's been working the last few years. And this project of his, Nudge Lebanon, has been at the heart of a conversation between the two of us, Ghassan, Moukheiber, and many others were part of that conversation, and we had hopes at one point, and I'm not giving up on that hope. تفضلوا. So we had hopes that this project will be somehow housed here at AUB, and I don't think we've given up on the idea of looking for the best modalities of associating Nudge Lebanon with AUB. هنشوف كيف بالمستقبل إن شاء الله. This institute that hosts this panel deals with public policy. And as you all know, public policy in Lebanon is quite complicated in terms of the processes that the avowed, the unavowed, the perceivable, and the obscure processes that are behind any policy decision that government takes. But I think there is a wide belief that much of the policy making happens in Parliament because people associate policy making with legislation. And that is true. The real policy discussions are the ones that happen when parliamentarians debate a draft law. I can bear witness to the fact that the Council of Ministers does not spend much time in policy making. And I remember a couple of instances where some of us sort of raised the simple question, what is our policy on this, that, or the other? And there were voices in the Council of Ministers who replied saying, we're here to make decisions, not to write policies, policy studies, policy, or make policy recommendations. So the locus of policy thinking seems to be Parliament, and I'm not referring to the Parliament as a whole, but to committees in the Parliament, commissions that are active in legislation. Now, because of that, there are many people, including NGOs, actors in civil society, who think that the best way to develop a new policy is to try and work on a new law. It makes sense at times, makes less sense in other circumstances, because some of our laws are not bad. The problem is with compliance with those laws. And in a state based on the rule of law, in a system that is supposed to be democratic, before you change a law, you make sure people comply with it, and then you draw the lessons from compliance and non-compliance, then look into drafting a new law. So this project of Dr. Makki I believe, helps us in a way, in an indirect matter, make policy through legislation only after we have tried, at least in some areas, to entice people to comply with the existing laws. I mean, think of the traffic law in Lebanon. Everybody says, traffic law, مش منيحة, let's have another law. But before we think of having another law, have we even attempted to comply with the present traffic law? And I think with Nudge Lebanon, we might be able to work on those issues and give concrete examples on how best we could enhance compliance with the traffic law. That is my first point. My second point is, it is my hope that a project like this one, Ahla wa Sahla, the second possible objective of this project is to help us Lebanese reconcile. Now I better choose carefully my word. The perceived private good with the perceived public good. When I say perceived, I mean public good and private good are often constructs, often ideological in a way, and but they need to be reconciled, and we need to be convinced. People need to be convinced that their actual, not just only their perceived, but their actual private good does not contradict public good. Quite the contrary. Public good is in their favor. Again, if you take traffic rules, if this is one example, I mean, traffic rule is obvious. It's not just the fear of repressive measures that should be the primary incentive for complying with the rule, but our own private good that is almost identical to the public good in that particular case. So the gap is very narrow between the two. Now, my third and last point is again the hope that this project would sort of initiate us into transcending the dualist, Manichaeist distinction between our identity as citizens and our attitudes as consumers. Being a citizen means primarily having rights and obligations, and most of us prefer to be treated as citizens than treated as consumers. But we're often treated more as consumers than as citizens. We are citizens in relation to the state, and consumers in relation to the market. Though many people affirm themselves as citizens, they have little trust in the state and have more trust in the market. De facto trust in the market, even if they are not ideologically admirers of neoliberal capitalist market economy. They have little trust, and they believe that market forces regulate our relations in a way that protects, at the end of the day, our interests as consumers. All citizens are equal under the law, and citizenship is a unifying status. Consumption is an individualized activity, and it is identified by markets and capitalizes on distinction. There are many people who ask me, why is it that L'Orient Le Jour is the only newspaper that has no economic problems compared to every other, though those who read French newspapers, are daily newspaper in Lebanon, are not a majority in the country. Far from. And the only simple answer is that the readership of L'Orient Le Jour is differentiated in terms of class in such a way that it gets more advertisement addressed to this specific group of people than any other newspaper in Lebanon. And that's the main, if not, it's not certainly not the only, the main reason why L'Orient Le Jour is financially healthier than any other daily in Lebanon. So the market capitalizes on distinction between us in terms of our age, our gender, our taste, our class, and in Lebanon, our religious community. The public as citizenry is homogeneous. The public as consumer is differentiated and hybrid. So consumer interests and citizens' rights are not always the same, but they need not be too far apart. And it's my sincere hope, Fadi, that Nudge Lebanon will bridge this gap between our rights and obligations as citizens and our interests as consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be surrounded by two, quite honestly, great role models for me, each in his own way in public sector reform. Both of them have guided me, have been really a true source of inspiration, and I'm so glad to be surrounded by Dr. Mitri and MP Ghassan Moukheiber. So, over 20 years, I've done public sector reform, both as inside government, as DG, and for government, as advisor for many governments in the region. I've done strategies, I've restructured ministries, organization, helped in transformation, but nothing has been as exhilarating and as transformative as literally stumbling upon this field of behavioral science. Since then, literally 3 years ago, I literally became a passionate and reborn behavioral economist with a strong baggage of public policy background. And I'm gonna share some of that experience with the hope to transmitting some of that passion to you. So I will start with telling you about what I'm going to cover. So I will introduce very briefly the concept of nudges and behavioral insights. I'll share lessons learned from the rise of what we call nudge units and behavioral insights centers around the globe. And I'll discuss applications of nudging and behavioral insights into a variety of public policy settings. And last, I will introduce Nudge Lebanon and its action plan. So, if we're trying to influence people's behavior, we typically have two policy levers. So we tell someone, if you don't do this, you'll be punished. This is what we call some kind of a command and control and enforcement approach. And the other one is, if you do this, I will reward you. The first one doesn't always work. We are a case in point. Look at all the laws around us. And the second one is not sustainable. So nudging, I like to introduce it as the third way. Without kind of, and I stress this is not an alternative, this is a complementary policy tool. So technically, and I'm using the definition of Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, nudging is any aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behavior and steers them in the right direction without forbidding any options and without significantly changing the economic incentives. So, 4 key features of nudging. 1, it's a small, tiny little intervention that creates behavior change. It's not a heavy-handed regulation. It creates changes in context, so what we call choice architecture, which is about the way you frame and present choices to people. Thirdly, it is definitely a cost-effective, so a subsidy is not a nudge. And last, it is freedom-preserving. So it respects people's right of choice and characterized by what we call libertarian paternalism. So take an example. If you want to stop people from littering in the streets, the 2 key policy levers you have is enforce a litter ban, and good luck, and fine citizens if they do that. The second one, pay people for using the garbage bin. The first one doesn't work. The second one is not sustainable. You can try nudge by maybe using social norms, telling them that most people do not litter in this area, or placing very salient green footprints directing towards the nearest garbage bin, and so on. Take another example. If you want kids to buy healthy food at school cafeteria, again, a command and control approach would be ban junk food from the cafeteria. Good luck. The second one, I'm sure kids, I know my kids will find a way around this, but the second one is give them financial rewards for eating healthy. The first one doesn't work, the second one is not sustainable. Nudging could be through making foods more attractive or convenient by placing them next to the cashier, or placing food at eye level and taking the junk food a little bit away and making it more difficult to get. So nudging is and should be seen as a complementary tool for those 2 policy levers and not a perfect alternative. Why do we use nudges? It could be for austerity measures. A government would like to save, wants to make sure it's cost-effective rollout of compliance measures, saving on administrative procedures, or it could be that laws are not working. And in that case, either because they don't have the right injection of behavioral insights, or they do not factor the biases and heuristics that people have and affect their tendency to depart from the rationality. So what are these biases and heuristics? We are people who are affected by what other people do. We experience loss aversion. We have status quo bias. We procrastinate and postpone things even if they're against our interest. We are overconfident. We kind of overpromise and underdeliver. We have a decision paralysis in front of so many information. So these biases and mental shortcuts are generally the result of what we call the automatic and fast unconscious system 1. So this is a dual theory that was put forward by Danny Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner in 2002. And he talks about a system 1, which we all have, which is automatic, intuitive, and fast, and guides a large part of our daily routine, which end up doing kind of automatically. But system 1, being fast and automatic and intuitive, is prone to error. We have a system 2, but contrary to system 1, it is conscious, it is effortful, and takes care of most of the complex decisions, but it's a lazy controller. So if we go to classical economics, for decades, that kind of stream assumed people's decision and behavior are based on deliberative thinking of system 2. So assuming people are rational, are econs, as we call them. So if you give any person a set of facts, they will make the best out of it. So they will make the optimal decisions. And most policies that we see around are designed with rational people in mind. Whereas the majority of people, I for one, I'm a human, so I make mistakes, I'm prone to errors, are humans and have their own biases. The fact that the fundamentals of economics are based on somewhat kind of unrealistic assumptions puts in question the current model of policymaking. So behavioral economics is that field which applies kind of psychological insights into human behavior to explain decision, and rejects the overly simplistic and sometimes naive assumption about human behavior, and proposes a more realistic model for explaining how people behave. So, in particular, behavioral economics takes into consideration that people are imperfect, that have biases, and prone to making mistakes. And the golden standard for behavioral economics is what we call randomized controlled trials and experimentation. So this is something that we borrow from clinical trials, from medicine, from pharmaceuticals. So just like in medicine, you determine the impact of these different interventions, in policies, there's a growing trend to use RCTs to assess impact of certain nudges and see how they could kind of be applied. So RCTs are the golden standard, and nudging has gained currency through effectively the seminal work of a group of behavioral scientists. Some of them are well known through a book called Nudge. Nudge is written by Ghassan and Richard Thaler, a Harvard professor and an economist from Chicago, and another book by Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, in addition to a large number of behavioral scientists who started questioning this field of this extreme mainstream of classical economics. Dan Ariely, George Lowenstein, Robert Cialdini, Paul Dolan, David Halpern, to name only a few. The second reason behind the rise of nudging is literally the rise of kind of nudge units around the world. And the first such nudge unit was set up by Prime Minister David Cameron in 2010. So he set up at the heart of 10 Downing Street a small unit, 7 people, headed by David Halpern, to work on policy experiments. So he set up that in 2010, and since then, it has been growing all over the world. So in Europe, it started growing in the EU, in Holland, Finland, Singapore, and then President Obama set up his own nudge unit inside the White House. It's called the Social Behavioral Sciences Team. And since then, it kept growing all the way to Australia, to Canada. Chancellor Merkel set up her own nudge unit recently. And it wasn't until last August that we saw the first nudge unit in the Middle East. And this is the Qatar Behavioral Insights Unit, and I have the honor of leading that. So this Qatar nudge unit is literally the first of its kind, and working on policy experiments, on bringing behavioral insights, greater adoption of behavioral insights in public policy, not only in Qatar, but also in the region by acting as a center of excellence. So that group is the governmental types of nudge units. In addition, there's a large number of non-governmental nudge units, those that are either in academia or in social purpose, such as NGOs. We stopped counting at about 150 of those, and it keeps changing. So every single university nowadays is setting up its own behavioral science initiative to work on policy experiments, and so on with many others in the social field. So I'll mention one in the CMU. It's very well known, the Kahneman Center at Princeton, headed by Eldar Shafir at Cornell. And there are, of course, several non-for-profit organizations. There is, of course, the Harvard Business Insights Group, Behavioral Insights Group. There's INAJU in Denmark, Busara Center. And Nudge Lebanon is hoping to join that group of non-for-profit organizations to work on nudging. And we're doing that in partnership with the Qatar Behavioral Insights Unit, who's supporting in this regard. So what we've learned so far as the rise of nudge units is concerned, is that we have now governmental nudge units, academic nudge unit, and non-governmental nudge units, and a lot of private sector are going into this. But many more nudge units are being set up as governmental units in the Middle East. So mark my word, within a year you'll have every single government in the GCC with a nudge unit. So a lot are working on their own. even countries in the Middle East that have not or not planning yet to do dedicated institutional setup are kind of undergoing or conducting randomized controlled trials through support by other institutions. So what are common types of nudges and that these units have been working on? We have developed an acronym for convenience called SHAPE differences, which we came up with, which is some kind of a checklist for the various types of nudges, which, when used in the right context, in a timely way, could produce the right impact that we hope to achieve. So salience is an important nudge. If you give a tip sheet and visual cues that could counter lack of self-control, it could help, for instance, reduce energy consumption. Default is a very important option, again, to counter status quo and inertia bias. It's often used, default options, so getting people to opt out as opposed to opt in, because we are lazy and we might postpone things that are in our interest. It's often used in getting people to enroll in pension schemes. Reminders, if they're personalized, are timely, could produce an amazing impact. Increasing vaccination rate, including cancer screening. Norms, social norms are an important nudge, especially, again, when we are social animals that like to conform to a group. So telling a group that they are outside of it or inside of it could have an impact of how people would like to belong. So telling someone about the energy consumption in relationship to their neighbors has been proven to have an impact on their pattern, on their consumption pattern. And at the end, a very favorite nudge of mine, which is simplification, which literally talks about simplifying procedures and processes to counter people's kind of decision paralysis in front of burdensome information. And it's been used in so many various kind of setups in achieving financial aid, enrollment, in completing kind of access to certain programs. So nudging can literally help in so many different policy areas. I'll give you an example in getting people to move more. So physical mobility is a policy challenge in many of the countries because of the new lifestyle that we have. So you can use small, tiny nudges to make movement fun. So by making stairs more attractive. This is one example, a very nice one, which literally shows you a railway station in Melbourne, Australia, where what they did, the nudge was simply an artwork that would make it more attractive. And that in itself increased use during rush hours by about 25% and off rush hours by more than 140%. This has been tested in so many different settings, so many different countries. So South Korea, Spain, calorie intake, Japan, Germany, making it fun like track. We are doing one just now in Qatar. Nudging has been also used to get people to pay their taxes on time. So in public finance management, a famous, a much quoted case is in the Behavioural Insights team, one of the first nudge units, in the world, basically helped the tax authority in the UK to bring forward faster payment of taxes. And literally, in one experiment, all they did is change a simple one sentence in the letter that goes typically to a control group, to the taxpayers, late taxpayers. All they said is 9 out of 10 of people around you pay their taxes on time. That in itself got more than 23% kind of faster payment as compared to the control group. A tiny little nudge using the social norm. Nudging can also increase savings because we know that we all like to save, but we never follow through on our commitment. We'll do it tomorrow. We all promise that. So in one very nice experiment done by Dan Ariely and his colleagues at Duke University, they worked on an experiment to try to increase saving rates within a group of informal workers. And they used more than 11 types of nudges. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but what's interesting, this is another reminder that we're not rational. We don't necessarily choose the best nudge. So they did that nudge on several treatments. Some of them got a reminder, other ones get a personalized reminder, as if it's coming from their children. And so many other nudges, such as a pre and post matching by the bank, which should have been the most probably intuitively kind of lucrative. But what worked, all of them outperformed the control, but what worked successfully was a tiny little token, a coin that was given on which it was basically showing the 24 weeks of the period of the trial, on which people could scratch the week they saved. So that more than tripled the saving rate per person. A simple nudge, a token that was given to that particular intervention group and worked more than the others. We were inspired by that at the Qatar Behavioural Insights Unit, and we did something similar. So we had the Workers' Welfare Forum. It is some kind of a forum to get workers to voice in complaints about workers' standards welfare. So basically, we noticed that this is not being used. So there are, of course, a lot of behavioral bottlenecks around this, but we addressed one of them, in particular that representatives acting on behalf of these workers are not bringing as many complaints in the monthly forum. So we did an RCT, a micro experiment, and we handed over a simple token, which is a book, which had the types of complaints that they could bring, and next to them a space where they could write next to each page the type of complaint that was brought by workers. And we tested it. So among those who got that treatment, that token, there were 31% more complaints. And of course, it had more impact on the quality of complaints. So there were, instead of only food and accommodation, nowadays we have even types, work conditions, which was a taboo until very recently. So a simple token in that case helped nudge a representative to bring in more complaints into the forum. We also did at the Qatar Behavioural Insights Unit another nudge, which basically created environmentally conscious behavior that can last a lifetime. So this is a very fun experiment, and it's a very simple one. So we wanted to try to reduce the use of paper when people dry their hands in toilets, in restrooms. So all we did is put a very salient tip sheet in a timely way in front of the mirror where they kind of finish washing up their hands. And we wrote on it, did you know you can dry your hands with only one paper? And it has 2 tips. All you have to do is shake your hands very well. And the second one, you have to fold the paper. That in itself brought down use of paper by 50%, greater or lesser extent between female and male restrooms. A tiny little sheet. That in itself on one floor is equivalent to around 700 packs of paper in 1 year. And hopefully that will become part of the legacy for contributing, even if modestly, to a carbon-neutral World Cup. In traffic, of course, there are so many illustrations of successful innovative nudges. Just give you one where a 3D visual kind of bump helped reduce speed by more than 38%. Imagine what this can do to, in some cases, if we apply it. So in addition to the health, tax, inclusion, labor, and environment, nudging literally can be used in every single policy area. So in education also, we have so many cases where texting parents by school teachers around performance of their children can help improve in terms of, create improvement in terms of their grades or their work habits. Energy, again, I mentioned about some social kind of norms who help reduce consumption patterns in some cases. So why nudge Lebanon? I will bring 4 reasons why we thought of this initiative. So many of the policy challenges that we are facing in Lebanon have a behavioral component. So if you address some of that, and I'm not saying we're going to resolve it drastically, you can make a difference. If it's a tiny little difference and in a cost-effective way. Enforcement, we are a case in point for a disintegrated enforcement mechanism. Look at the laws, many of the laws around it. Despite great effort by MP Ghassan Moukheiber, who's working now on a big workshop on looking at all the laws that are not being enforced to see how they can do about it. So a lot of them can be complemented with few nudges. Another reason why we thought of this is that we're almost broke as a nation, so nudging can be a very cost-effective tool that also could complement the command and control type. And last, there is a vast need for evidence-based policymaking and advocacy, not only for government. Government definitely would benefit from evidence-based policymaking, but also NGOs, who could be this big source of misrepresentation if they don't rely on evidence-based in their advocacy. And we've seen this, the garbage saga, how various NGOs at various sides could just argue without evidence. So Nudge Lebanon, we are the first initiative in this to apply behavioral insight and addressing policy challenge. Our vision is to nudge for development and the rule of law. This is high on our agenda, using behavioral insight and applied policy tools. We're guided by values such as rule of law, citizenship, partnership, empowerment, and libertarian paternalism. We're about three things. We are an observatory for policy research, a lab for policy experimentation, and a platform for policy advocacy. So in the observatory, what we do is bring in best practices, RCTs that were done, experiments all over the world, and bring them to bear to the current situation that provide ideas for potential replication of these nudges. We also talk to stakeholders to bring some of their most interesting challenges with a behavioral route, to also bring as potential blueprints ideas for experiment. We're also planning to launch kind of a consumer citizen space for people, for all of you, for anyone to volunteer ideas for experiments that could be taken forward. We are a lab, so we take some of those, and then with the bandwidth that we have, hopefully will grow, we will experiment. So we will design and implement RCTs and other types of micro-experiments. We'll collaborate with academic institutions to extend use of experimentation to staff, to faculty, to students, to give them a real exposure before they graduate. And last, we are a platform. So we'll use these results, this outcome, these experiments, and transform them into hopefully recommendation for behaviorally informed regulation. So having somebody like MP Ghassan Moukheiber is extremely important, because they are the recipients of much of these insights, which they can use into new legislation, into old legislation, and into even kind of decisions by stakeholders. A lot of it could also be used, hopefully, by NGOs, which could act on this in rolling out some of these experiments. I'm going to share with you some of the experiments we did over the last few years. One of them is in partnership with EDL, Électricité du Liban. The challenge in that case was to get people to pay on time. As you know, if you're not at home, you receive a slip, basically telling you that you owe kind of 400,000 Lebanese pounds, that the collector is coming back in 2 days. Okay? And it says in kind of tiny little note, if you're not going to be there, then probably you're going to be kind of sent into arrears and maybe pay a penalty. So a lot of people don't pay the second time. And even though the law says the collector should only go once, the next time after 2 days, many people see that the collectors would come twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, because the collector cannot go back to EDL before he's collected about 80% of his round. The rest would go as mutaakhirat and arrears and would be sent to court and fines. So the challenge was to make sure that people pay at the second visit. So we did, this one was a kind of a random selection of the control group, and we did 3 types of nudges corresponding to 3 types of slips, which we developed and then trained some of the collectors in a pilot area, which was Saida. So the first nudge was literally using what we call the hassle factor. We told groups in this particular nudge that basically telling them that literally it's very inconvenient if you don't pay in 2 days, because it's going to mean you're going to have to go to the headquarters between 7:30 and 1:30. It's really inconvenient. So وفر على حالك المصاري والمشوار وادفعها ببيتك. So that was the first nudge. We all thought that's going to work most. The second one, we realized that within 40 days, actually around 90% do pay on time. But really بيكونوا طلعوا له روحه للcollector. So we did tell them that literally in your region, in your area, which is true, around 90% pay on time. So do you want to be part of this group? And the third one, we said, yes, I mean, ODL is not doing well, but thanks, among other things, to people not paying on time. So do you want to play your role as good citizen and pay on time? So these were the results. Quite interesting. So all of them outperformed the control group. And the two that were most significant, statistically significant, were the social norm and the national pride. One by 13%, the other one by 15%. All with a tiny little nudge, telling them about how they could pay, why they should pay on time. This is going to be rolled out in other regions and could be applied to other utility sectors. Very cost effective. It cost us less than £100 to produce this. Another one we did is on seat belts. It's a favorite for all of us. I tried to get statistics on use of seatbelt in Lebanon. Apparently, the last available official statistic go back to 2004. And then the rate was around 12% or 14%. Since then, there were kind of new regulations, several attempts of enforcement. Probably it went a little bit further, but not much further. Okay? So basically, we ran an experiment, a pilot experiment with the Four Seasons. And basically, we were trying to see how can you increase compliance with the seatbelt using some nudges that we learned from behavioral insights. So what we did is observed for a group that were receiving the cars by the valet and checking if they're going to put their seatbelts. So what we had is 42% only used their seatbelts. So when the valet delivered the car, only 42% put their seatbelts. The nudge consisted of literally a timely, prompt, verbal cue telling the driver, be safe, please don't forget to put your seatbelt. أو بالعربي لسلامتك, please ما تنسى تحط حزام الأمان. That took compliance, and then we observed, by almost double, by 83%. A tiny, simple, and timely prompt to get people to put their seatbelts. And now this is going to be rolled out, hopefully with support from other NGOs working in the field, because we're not going to be there. We provided the evidence for that, and that could be rolled out to other hotels. Simple training to people, and could be taken also to valets in restaurants, and there are so many of those. Imagine the impact of such a thing. So a beautiful complementarity between enforcement and a tiny little nudge that is cost-effective. We're also going to focus on a variety of traffic-related ones. We did one that we're going to complete now, hopefully with the help of municipality of Beirut, to help drivers to stop at the right sign, not in front of the sign, because it's no longer in the sight of the traffic light. If you're just 1 meter beyond it, then too late, buddy, then you're not going to see if it turns green. And we've seen in one case next to Nadi Riyadi, where literally similar pattern, we've observed more than 100 cycles from green to red. And we've seen that a lot of cars would simply not stop. And by not stopping at the right place, they would keep the cars behind from going. So often, we observed that in a particular place, it was only 12 seconds, so from green to red. Sometimes, because someone is standing beyond the line, by the time it turns green, and then somebody horns, and then it says, what's wrong, and then so on. Basically, he's the only one passing, and that on the red light. So -1, it's not like 1 or 2 pass. And at the free flow, you can go to almost 6. So the nudge is going to be a tiny little thing, maybe just bring attention, something salient, maybe telling them about social norm, but it's all about experiment. We don't know which one will work, but we're a lab, so we're going to experiment with several of those nudges. Also going to do on U-turns. We did a lot of experiments on U-turns. Of course, there are so many places where you see no U-turns. And of course, we would do an observation on what happens. Literally, sometimes one violation of a particular spot in a U-turn, and it could reduce the free flow by more than 20%. So a simple nudge could maybe use social norm, or telling them literally you can pass with 2 others, or let 16 others pass. I don't know. It might not work, but if I can improve kind of compliance with this with a cost-effective way, it's worth trying it. We're also going to try other cases, and we've seen so many examples of kind of painting the optical bars next to curves to give the illusions of speeding up, so getting people to reduce speed, and that was tried in various places. We can also do it in a kind of creative way. It was done by planting trees also closer and closer to one another as you turn, in a way to give a physical illusion that you are speeding up. So again, tiny little things, it's a win-win for the environment, but also in a cost-effective way. So we're trying to test some of those with municipalities, and then we'll see. We'll tell you more about this. There's a lot of potential application to bring forward arrears, municipal arrears, household. You might not like me for doing this, but I mean, it's something we can do. There's so much that could be done to get people to pay tax on time in a nice and easy and simplified way. But we're going to roll out the ADL across Lebanon to other utility sectors. We're going to try also bringing the social norm to get people to save more by telling them what the neighbors like, I mean, very, very similar in size do. Also lifestyle, we're going to test that in school cafeteria. We just finished one experiment as the Qatar Behavioural Insight Unit with the Kennedy School, literally in getting people to shop in a healthy way by placing fruits and vegetables in a very salient way next to cashiers. We'll tell you about the results very soon. So, but we can do something similar in school cafeteria. I'm not saying banning junk food, I'm just keeping them as an option. If you put them in a nice way, people could be interested, and making it simple, easy, accessible, so on. This is a kind of a fun experiment we're going to hopefully test in Beirut, where we could get people to use the stairs, and we could invite artists to come up with ideas for making it more attractive. But there are so many innovative ideas to kind of nudge people to move a little bit more. And there are various other areas where we could use kind of nudging and behavioral insights. So in inclusion, financial inclusion, in anti-corruption, we can do a lot in this regard. And I have my board members on LTA in this. We hopefully are going to work on this in humanitarian, Syrian refugee cases, charitable giving, education. There are so many things that could be done. I'm finishing with one initiative that is very dear to my heart. It's the Consumer Citizen Lab. Basically, this is our jewel offering of Nudge Lebanon, which we would like to make it as our offering to academia. Basically, it's designed to bring greater involvement of academic institutions in public policy experimentation and nudging, and provide real-life exposure to students and through engaging them with public entities and NGOs, and create a shared space for citizens. We're going to also try to do something similar, by the way, on Consumer Citizen Lab Junior for schools as well, whereby it becomes some kind of a community development, where it also gives students a tiny kind of way of experimenting with tiny little nudges, such as papers, such as things where they can see for themselves how they could apply it. So this is the Consumer Citizen Lab. What we'll do in this is source cases and policy challenges from stakeholders, design and create a course that talks about application of behavioral economics to public policy. So the foundation, the literature review, nudge units, nudging, fundamentals of psychology and behavioral science. And the second part would be how do you apply experiments to policy challenges? And we will help them co-deliver the course and run the lab through the various kind of value chain stages of a randomized controlled trial. And at the end, we'll take those recommendations to my dear friends as behaviorally inspired recommendations.
Like a rablat.
So we're hoping to have those two gentlemen part of this advisory board for Nudge Lebanon. And we have others that will join. Also, Fatima Kaik will be part of this group. We have other people who will be joining us, representing various other disciplines. He's a medical doctor. Dr. Azdin is going to be joining us, and a few others. And the team who are all these passionate believers in the true power of behavioral economics. And basically, just to tell you one last note, our project will have an ethical review. They do have an ethical review. We have two levels. Those that have a zero to insignificant risk, we do it internally. We have some kind of, we don't have an IRB because as NGOs you don't need an IRB, but we're trying to set the standard very high and develop something similar. And anything above insignificant risk, we're gonna escalate it to the advisory board and even bring external review for that. And I'm just a word of caution, as nudging becomes more prominent in this part of the world, there's a need for standard setting. And it's important for us to start thinking about potential misuse of the evidence that could be used by this. In concluding thought, so many lessons for me in behavioral economics. It taught me several things. It taught me that we're wrong, we're prone to mistakes. Really what works, it taught me most of what works is not what you and I and others, and certainly not politicians, think works. What works is what has been tested in a rigorous randomized controlled trial or an experiment to work. Any other than that is a reliance on intuition. And why should we? So give an example of clinical trials, drug authorities around the world, the FDA, just look what they do. I mean, even for small medical products, before you bring them in, you have to undergo years sometimes of experiments between control and treatment groups. For policies that potentially affects thousands and even millions, you don't even try to do that. This is starting to change with the rise of nudge units all over the world. This just started to change with Qatar leading the way on the Behavioral Insight Unit. We're hoping through Nudge Lebanon to join that debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fadi. I see a lot of enthusiasm. So we'll have a reception at the end, and that will give Fadi the opportunity to recruit some of you for Nudge Lebanon. Now, Ghassan, تفضل.
Yes, thank you very much. Look, Tarek and Fadi, thank you for inviting me on this panel. It is my pleasure. And I think that what you've presented is fascinating. I invite all of you to read more about it, as I tried to do, in order to prepare myself. But I had not prepared myself to this fascinating presentation. Why didn't you show it before? I'm very happy to be part of that. I sincerely pledge to you and to the others that it's an experiment worth making, and particularly taking it to the real world out there of politicians and the Lebanese people. Now, let me tell you that in terms of behavioral informed legislation, which is a strange word to bring to my colleagues in Parliament or in the government, let's start with the first strange word and translate nudge in Arabic. It is going to be a nightmare for Nudge Lebanon. But anyways, beyond the semantics and beyond the words, I think what I consider extremely valid from my perspective and from yours, I think, for many of you, is just bridging the gap between rule setting and enforcement. I think this gap is huge in Lebanon. Some rules are unwritten, are extremely strong and abided by the people, and others that take months, probably years, to be developed and voted by the government and parliament, and they simply don't work. In Parliament, we have set up not a nudge unit, But because it has become such an invasive thing that laws don't get enforced, that Parliament decided to establish an ad hoc committee on law enforcement and asking questions, why do we have so many laws that are not enforced? And I think that's a very important question. And I'll take an example, and I would like to test some of the ideas as we should in a university setting or also lab setting. Let me test you all, and I'll test you with some thoughts about nudging and behaviorally modified legislation or enforcement. We all know that smoking is banned in public places, right? Who hates going into a restaurant where everybody is smoking shisha and the others? Yeah, many of you, yeah. How many don't mind? Only one doesn't mind. Yeah, I think you have the shisha in the car. Yes, there are so many, and yet we cannot find a restaurant when there's no shisha and there's no smoke. It's one of those extremely annoying laws that were passed. It took us years. We've consulted, we've discussed WHO, everyone was there. So why wouldn't this law apply, and how can nudge help? So I'll put you to the test of this, because sometimes I think that nudge is almost a common sense thing, because it's been several months that my wife was working on a nudge. She's part of this tobacco-free initiative. Mm-hmm. And they were trying to design a list of complying restaurants as a positive nudge to restaurants, and put them on the list and make that list available to people so they can use it. Is that a nudge? I think so. Can there be many more? Let me tell you that beyond this, I think that we have a series of many other problems in terms of laws and their enforcement. And I would probably urge Nudge Lebanon to go slightly beyond the simple issue of how you can make things better. And it seems to me that, and that's my first comment, it might be the difference that I would make between effective and efficient. It seems to me that nudging helps enforcement be more efficient rather than effective. Well, in Lebanon, we lack both. We lack effectiveness as much as we lack efficiency. And I think that along these lines, I wonder if in the theory of nudge, you have the so-called traditional ways that are not wiped out. They still exist, but they are reinforced by other factors. And I think that this is an area that would require us some thought between, so that distinction that I would make between effectiveness and efficiency, both reinforcing each other. My second comment would be the paramount importance of rule setting. One cannot nudge in a ruleless place. So you need to establish a rule in order to know how to enforce it. And if I take your picture of the staircase that is painted, in Lebanon, sometimes you don't have a staircase to paint. Visually, I mean, not only for the stairs, but as an icon, as a picture, you don't have those fundamentals of rules that are accepted, that are properly enacted, that are well set and accepted. Because it seems to me that in most of these areas, when you want to change behavior, the change of behavior is not disputed on and by itself. So if you say, for instance, that smoking kills, I guess that there is a nudge on the boxes of cigarettes, which is a picture of dying people of ugly lungs or cigarette kills. But that doesn't stop people from buying cigarettes and from cigarettes being so widely established. So I think that my other comment there has to do with Tarek's earlier introductory comments about Parliament as being a center for policy making. I always like to remind us, tell you about Bismarck used to compare legislation, making laws to making sausages. Bismarck used to say that you might like to eat the sausage, but you might not like to see it how it's done. So you might not like to see how the laws are done. So before going into the nudge, it's also important, that's what I'm involved in, is making laws better, lawmaking becoming better. And that's an important thing that can tie up nicely with what the Fares Institute here is doing in terms of policy setting. My next comment has to do with quality legislation, right? I think that you can only nudge things that are proper to start with. Again, you cannot create a nudge on non-existent stairs. That's the absence of rules. But I question also not only the existence or non-existence of rules that are accepted, but the quality of those rules, be them laws, decrees, standards, behaviors, what have you. What can we do to improve those rules before we nudge their implementation? Because it would be interesting before engaging into the nudge analysis, I think, is to engaging into the analysis of why isn't this law enforced? Why is it not applied? And is nudging in that case, and I want to be provocative in order to continue the conversation, like putting a plaster on an open wound. It adds effectiveness, or it's only about efficiency. So why aren't rules enforced? There may be several reasons for that. Part of it be cultural, but we don't like rules. We don't like to, we are so individual, but that can be overcome because this is a behavioral attitude. One can influence behavioral attitudes. But what if the rule is badly set? Some are saying that the law on banning smoke in public spaces, places, was not appropriately drafted, that it has things that have to be changed. Is the real problem of the law with the way that people perceive it or enforce it? Is it appropriate or inappropriate? Do people know about it? Most of the times, the issue of law enforcement has to do with information. Information is a gateway to enforcement. And I think that in many of the examples that were given about nudging, it's informing people about unwritten rules, such as shake your hands and fold your paper to save on wash on paper. Now, yes, this is an unstated rule. It's interesting that you bring enforcement, that is the nudge, by just stating it. Taking the example of streets, and in my readings, I was extremely interested to know that the first nudge was just the white lines on the street, that who goes right and who goes left, and you don't trespass, and when can you go, and when you can't. That was before rules were written. So I think that the center, and I'm extremely excited to be associated with this experiment, because my original liking is legal sociology, and behavioralism would add to it, because understanding why rules and how rules are set and why do they work and why don't they work, in my opinion, has to be much broader than what nudge does. It complements it, and it adds a lot to it. I think it's exciting, but we sometimes are much more basic elements of law enforcement and law setting. Now, my last, probably one of my last comments would be about the way that Parliament, the government, opening up, this center and Nudge Lebanon, opening up to decision makers. I had made you the offer, and I repeat it here, that I would like us to link up both the Committee on Law Enforcement in Parliament and the Nudge Unit in Lebanon. Because it will link, that will be a reality check. You're right, you sometimes need lab rats. I'm willing to be one of them. Many of us in Parliament would. We'll put a different title to Rabla.
More dignified.
Yes, more dignified. Yeah. But I think it is important. And I think that the university...
Animal lab.
Yeah, politicians are strange animals. We need to bridge that gap between the university and the real world. And I think that such a nudge unit is an amazing tool that was tested in England and tested in the US. You're testing it in Qatar. I'm extremely happy that you're bringing it to Lebanon. It's going to be fascinating to see how those two worlds will collide or collaborate. I hope they will collaborate. And in order to look at this broader picture, but within it, I think that the nudge concept, the nudge factor, is an extremely interesting, promising, and I would say fascinating intrusion of behavioralism into legislation and enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghassan. I think you've uploaded enough, so I don't take words of praise. I only take questions or comments. تفضل. هلا بياخدوا له في ميكرو بلدر. يلا بيان.
Okay, no praise, but thanks for the invitation. That works. First, as a person who's been working on governance reforms across the world and in the region for the last 12 years now, I think this approach is not an option. It's actually the only way to go forward in countries where the rule of law is structurally and systemically weak. And as far as I know, there is no other option that I see now, depending on laws and expecting that laws will change behavior, will not work on its own like we've been doing it and like we've seen others try to do it. It might be pessimistic in a way to say that, but being an optimistic person, I actually like to see it the other way. I see this opening and opportunity. In the program that I run in the region, we've started that actually in Morocco, working with 7 public hospitals, reputational incentives, using data collected from patients based on their experiences, and then using that data to share it with the officials in the hospitals, with the management in the hospitals, and use it as in trainings and sort of positive reinforcement and also positive competition. And we've seen a change in behavior, to a positive change. So that is quite interesting in that sense. And we're certainly looking forward to expand on that. Now, there's a lot to say about the presentation. It's really, again, thanks a lot for that. What's interesting is that the most successful nudges were ones that were associated, like with the social norms or with like the patriotic decision to make. And this is quite interesting because this brings up the question of context, right? So I really applaud your courage to come to Lebanon and to try that. And that's where your patriotic side has come up. Because the issue of the social norm and being like 90% doing the right thing, and do you want to be part of that 90%? I think it's the other way around in most of the things. Like 90% are not doing the right thing. So that's one. 2, also the kind of patriotic and identity thing. Now, it's great. It's actually very interesting that you have a successful example in Lebanon. So that's why I'm also optimistic that even in a country like Lebanon, where we always complain that social norms are skewed and where we say that there is no identity or a sense of belonging, it actually succeeded. But it's one experiment, so let's see. And on that note, I see an opportunity. Yesterday, we had the Access to Information Law in Lebanon published in the Official Gazette. And that law is really about getting government to disclose, proactively publish certain documents, on the one hand, so proactive disclosure, and then citizens to actually having the right to demand some information or ask for some information. And here there's a lot of nudging that needs to be done, not for citizens, but for officials and for ministries to encourage them to start actually comply. So I see an opportunity there. And I see something where we can work on this anti-corruption thing, but also broader access to information is beyond anti-corruption. So I see an opportunity and expressing full support and interest to be part of this work and hopefully help it in the future.
Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Bashur. هون قدام. حدا هون ايه. Sorry. I'll come back to you. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to break the rule of no praise because I was very excited to read this because as you a few years ago when I started reading behavioral economics, I got extremely excited and I wondered, why doesn't this happen in Lebanon? And thankfully it's finally happening. So thank you. So my question, it's more of a suggestion than a question. So there are two aspects that, you know, there are two things that you have to identify, right? In order to make the appropriate intervention. The first is the behavior that you want to change, and the second is, you know, the little intervention that you want to do, and then see if that's successful. So I guess my suggestion would be, in terms of the behaviors that you want to change, why not crowdsource that and, you know, have a website where you say people can go in, identify behavioral issues that, you know, affect people, yeah, to be worked on. And then someone who wants to come up with an idea can go in and have a list of all these behavioral things, and then they can come up with an intervention.
Yeah. Thank you. عليك أخونا.
First of all, it's great to see Dr. Fadi heading back in his wealth of knowledge to Lebanon, so which is amazing. I had the honor to work closely with him during the Ministry of Economy and Trade. And actually he walks the talk because he managed to change the consumer protection law in a record-breaking time. So that's quite amazing. It's good to have bring nudge to Lebanon. The two major challenges, and I'll tap on what Mr. Moukheiber said, bringing it to the real world. The concern is definitely having the right foundation in this country. And the two top-of-mind challenges is, one, having the proper infrastructure, and two, most importantly, is the compliance of the enforcer and not the consumer or the user, if I may say. And here, if we're talking about law abiding and let's say the traffic law, so the infrastructure is at least having the zebra lines visible on the streets, having the right traffic signs, having the right signages on the streets, and last but not least, having the right enforcement from the enforcer. So they have to be compliant at least to walk the talk because they are the role models. And that's is the main challenge. I'll just tap quickly on the tobacco law. I think the major mistake was, first, the lack of education and communication with the public. And second of all, it wasn't phased in terms of the law, because if you follow the WTO, there are phases. So you go into separation and then segregation, and then you can't completely stop it. Yeah, WHO, sorry. And that's probably what happened in that case. So thank you.
WTO.
It keeps coming back to me.
So that
is coming back.
yeah, exactly. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more? Napti? Rima? Where is Rima? Rima Afifi. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. A very interesting talk. A lot of our work has been trying to identify critical challenges in Lebanon and see how we can spark innovation related to them. But what we realized actually is that most of the challenges where we are working, the root causes are not the water or the electricity or the health or the education, etc. They are related to culture and governance. And in our work, we're trying to see how we can focus more efforts around addressing culture and governance. And I see a lot of parallels here with this, but I guess somehow to echo some of the comments, but also to maybe encourage more, that more of the nudges, I think, need to be to the people who are in the positions in government. How can we direct more of this to their behavior? Because their behavior is oftentimes not addressing the challenges or is directly the cause of a lot of the problems. So I'd be curious how more of this sort of nudging can be applied to the centers of governance as well.
Professor Afifi, Rima?
Thank you. Thank you, Fadi, and thank you for having this panel. I think that the concept of nudge is extremely exciting because of what it's bringing all over the world in terms of changes. But there also have been critiques of nudge. And so the two that I think come to mind most often, I guess, are one, whether it gives governments easy outs. So they get to work on, so the problem is transferred to the person. You know, we're trying to get the people to change their behavior as opposed to changing social circumstances in which we live. And the second is that it has potential for actually increasing social injustice. And so the example of the cars, you know, if you have a valet, you know, if you go to these places that have valets, you get a reminder. If you don't get a reminder. If you get an electric bill and you can pay that bill, then you comply very well. If you can't pay the bill, you become a non-complier, and then there's this community that's even more likely to be judged badly. So just, I think it's very important as we move forward on these very exciting initiatives that actually get us where we want to go, to keep in mind the potential critiques and try to figure out how we deal with them.
Good, thank you very much for all of this and for this very last question. Fadi.
Well, where do I start from? Let me just say up front that basically a lot of the problems have behavioral root, but some of them don't have a behavioral root, and they're better addressed through regulation. So nudges don't necessarily resolve the problem, but they can make tiny improvements. And if these tiny improvements are small, but cost effective, it's worth giving it a try. So in some cases, it's significant results, but in some cases, it's 1 or 2%. But how about that? This is quite impressive if it's cost effective. So initially what we do, we start with any challenge. We've been kind of developing some proprietary methodology in this regard and develop a behavioral route for these challenges and see the entry point for doing the experiment. Of course, it's a lot of work to find that entry point. Anti-smoking is one of those issues. How can you apply social norm to reward those that are complying with the laws? There are things, but we need to experiment. We cannot guarantee the results. We could be informed by insights from previous RCTs that were done in this regard. So tiny improvement is what I want to say. And solution might not always be through the nudging. It could complement, but it might not work, in which case we need to work on the legislation to get them to inject more behavioral insights in what they do. In consumer protection laws, what we've learned in consumer protection law could be literally codified and brought into the legislation. We're not saying that you can bring that lock, stock, and barrel and then apply them. Context matter, but we have a very good and decent chance of starting from a higher level. So you're not starting from scratch. You know what worked. We're not Guatemala, we're not the UK, we're not the US, but we can learn so many lessons of what has worked, and you can design the initial blueprint of the experiment in a way that could probably kind of have a good success rate with few iterations. So just like the behavioral insights team have come forward with their concept of nudging and testing, it's about testing, learning, and adapting. So a lot of the times we start an experiment, we kind of reiterate, and then learn, and then bring back and restart the experiment. We're a laboratory, we cannot guarantee results. Somebody mentioned the consumer citizen space. We have actually exactly what you're asking for. So there will be, in the website, room for people to volunteer ideas for experiments, ideas for nudges, to be kind of brought forward and tested. And that is something that we will let you know how we intend to do it. We're still in an informal setting. We're just incorporating as a foundation, as an NGO, and we would love to kind of grow. It's literally through more cooperation with consumer citizens, but also with government. Somebody mentioned, how do we do kind of cooperation with governments. If they don't cooperate, then it's difficult to introduce some of the nudges. That's why partnership with not only parliament, but with government is essential. And I think the proposition is pretty decent for them. What you're helping them is literally pro bono and letting them experiment and then make improvements that make them look good and make a decent impact on the consumer citizen welfare in many cases. On Nasser's point on PPP, I'm proud to say that with Nasser, we launched the first public-private partnership. The hotline that we launched at the Ministry of Economy more than 13 years ago was in conjunction with the group led by Nasser. So I'm very happy that he's here talking about this. Now, the most difficult question, I have to confess, is raised by Dr. Afifi, and this is the critique. So on giving, the first point, the giving government the easy way out, at the end, بدنا ناكل عنب مش بدنا ناكل نقطة الناطور. So basically, if government is in total disintegration, I might as well step in, even if it helps him and helps us. It's okay to do it. As long as it's cost effective, as long as within some ethical framework, why not do it? And that's basically our kind of approach for this. Now, the more difficult question of social injustice, again, we're not here, a lot of the experiments, we're not taking away options from people. We are kind of currently experimenting in certain pilot manner to see where tiny improvements in compliance can happen. And there would be gaps that cannot be addressed in the nudges, and in which case there will be social injustice, but we need to think of different ways to address it through inclusion. And we have a kind of an initiative on not only financial inclusion, but social inclusion and gender inclusion. But you're raising some of the very difficult issues that now the Western countries that are kind of have had more than 10 years of experience dealing with nudges have started to address those. And there are more of the kind of accusations against government of paternalism. Is it really stepping in and then manipulating? There are important issues, and I'm just cautioning against one particular aspect, that is, there is potential for misuse. And this is something that we need to be all aware. Nudging is coming to the Middle East. It has come late, but better late than never. But it's extremely important to think about ethics, think about ethical reviews. Now, we don't have in the government setting and in non-government setting, non-academic setting, the IRB. So we've gone through so many different examples of kind of internal ethical reviews by nudge units, and we learned so much, and we tried to design our kind of ethical review around that. This said, when we created 2 levels, as I mentioned, but we're happy to kind of see what else we can do in terms of strengthening the ethics and make sure the abuse is minimized. But when we partner with universities, then this is when we kind of adopt their own IRB in the process. So that's, in that case, we go back to your kind of, in many cases, bureaucratic process, but we will adopt the same level of review. On smoking and anti-smoking, now, again, we're happy to experiment. But this is one of those cases where, of course, it's better addressed through proper enforcement. Nudges can make improvements, maybe through rewarding, using a social norm, some of those who are complying, and creating some kind of pride around the brand of those places that actually stand out there and say, we are proudly prohibiting compliance, prohibiting smoking. So there are things that we could try to do to kind of test nudges, but we need to experiment. We need to find the right entry point, kind of along the value chain of the policy challenge. We need to find an entry point and see which experiment we could do.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. We'll have a reception in the adjacent room, and you will have ample time to to ask Fadi more questions, and Fadi will have more time to see how best he can use all the competence and talent that is in this room. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. We have mugs that we've kind of brought for the occasion, Nudge Lebanon, so feel free to have your own.